It's the element of surprise. That Tuesday morning in October, I was about to discover just how powerful that weapon could be. I was in my bedroom, the master suite of what had been my home for 37 years, applying my signature red lipstick in the antique mirror that had belonged to my grandmother. My emerald eyes, the feature that had launched 1,000 compliments and twice as many proposals in my younger days, reflected back at me with their usual sharpness. Age had been kind to me. My silver hair fell in waves to my shoulders, and my skin, thanks to good genes and better skincare, barely showed my years. The house was quiet except for the distant murmur of my daughter Harlow's voice drifting up from the kitchen. She was on the phone again, probably coordinating another one of her charity luncheons or country club committees. At 37, Harlow had perfected the art of looking busy while accomplishing very little, a skill that seemed to run in her husband's family. I was fastening my pearl earrings when I heard the softest knock on my bedroom door. Before I could answer, it cracked open and a small face peered through. My 6-year-old granddaughter, Maisie, with her tousled blonde curls and eyes wide with concern. "Grandma Viv," she whispered, slipping into the room like a little conspirator. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, turning from the mirror to face her properly. Maisie was the light of my life, the only pure thing left in a family that had grown increasingly toxic over the years. "What's troubling you?" She climbed onto my bed, her small hands fidgeting with the silk comforter. "Mommy and Daddy were talking really loud last night after I went to bed. I heard them from my room." "What did they say, darling?" Maisie's lower lip trembled. "They said they're sending you away today. To a nursing home. Mommy said you can't take care of yourself anymore and that it's too much work having you here." The words hit me like ice water, but I kept my expression calm. Inside, something crystallized, a cold, hard certainty that I'd been a fool to trust my own daughter. "Did they say anything else?" "Daddy said something about papers and money, and that they'd finally have the whole house." Maisie's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma Viv, I don't want you to go away. Who's going to read me stories and make cookies with me?" I pulled her into my arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Don't you worry about a thing, my darling girl. Grandma has everything under control." But even as I comforted Maisie, my mind was racing. So this was their plan. After 3 years of living in my house, the house I'd bought and paid for, the house where I'd raised my children, the house that bore my name on the deed, they wanted me gone. Harlow and her husband Grant had been circling like vultures, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and claim their prize. What they didn't know was that Vivian Caldwell had been playing a much longer game than they realized. After Maisie scampered back to her room, I sat in my chair by the window, looking out at the manicured gardens I'd spent decades perfecting. The morning light caught the crystals in my chandelier, sending rainbows dancing across the cream-colored walls. Everything in this room, everything in this house, represented years of careful planning and shrewd investments that my family knew nothing about. When my husband Charles died 8 years ago, everyone assumed he'd left me comfortably provided for, but nothing more. They saw the widow in the suburban mansion, living off life insurance and Social Security, gradually becoming more dependent on her children's generosity. What they didn't see was the offshore accounts, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio that had grown to over $22 million through decades of careful, quiet accumulation. I heard footsteps in the hallway, Harlow's deliberate stride in her designer heels. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, as had become her habit. "Good morning, Mother," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of false cheer and barely concealed impatience that I'd grown to despise. "We need to talk." Harlow was beautiful in the way that money could make anyone beautiful. Perfectly highlighted hair, flawless makeup, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. But there was something cold in her blue eyes, something calculating that reminded me uncomfortably of her father at his worst. "Of course, darling," I said, standing to face her. "What's on your mind?" She clasped her hands together, the gesture she always used when she was about to deliver bad news disguised as good intentions. "Grant and I have been talking, and we think it's time to make some changes. You're getting older, Mother, and this house is so big and demanding. We're concerned about you living here alone." "I'm not alone," I pointed out mildly. "You and Grant and Maisie live here too." "Well, yes, but that's temporary. Grant's law practice is growing, and we're looking at houses in Westchester. When we move, you'll be by yourself, and frankly, we're worried about your safety." I nodded thoughtfully, as if her concern was genuine rather than transparent greed. "I see. And what do you suggest?" "There's a lovely assisted living facility about 20 minutes from here. Sunset Manor. It's very upscale, with activities and medical staff on site. We've already spoken to them, and they have a room available." "Today?" I asked, allowing just a hint of confusion to color my voice. "Well, yes. We thought it would be better to make the transition quickly, like removing a bandage. Grant has some paperwork for you to sign, just to make the transition smoother, and then we can get you settled in your new home."
Paperwork.
Of course. They wanted me out, and they wanted control of my assets, probably through some hastily drafted power of attorney that would give them access to what they thought was my modest nest egg. "That's very thoughtful of you, darling," I said, moving to my dresser and opening the jewelry box where I kept my everyday pieces. "I suppose I should pack a few things." "Oh, don't worry about that," Harlow said quickly. "The facility provides everything you need. Just bring some personal items, photos, maybe a few pieces of jewelry. We can always bring more later." Later, when they controlled the house and everything in it, I selected a simple gold bracelet and fastened it around my wrist, taking my time. "You know, Harlow, I've been thinking about making some changes myself. About my will, my investments, my plans for the future." I saw her eyes sharpen with interest, though she tried to hide it. "Oh, what kind of changes?" "Nothing dramatic," I said, moving toward the door. "Just some adjustments to ensure everyone gets what they deserve." Truer words had never been spoken. I walked downstairs to find Grant waiting in the living room, his briefcase open on the coffee table. He was 42, tall and lean, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that came from expensive grooming and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. He'd been a decent enough son-in-law for the first few years, but success had made him hungry, and hungry men were dangerous. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, standing as I entered. "I hope Harlow explained the situation. We really think this is for the best." "I'm sure you do," I said, settling into my favorite armchair, the antique wingback that had been my mother's. "May I see the papers?" He handed me a folder thick with legal documents. I scanned them quickly, noting the power of attorney forms, the property transfer agreements, the bank account authorizations. Everything designed to strip me of control, while making it look like I was voluntarily stepping aside. "This is quite comprehensive," I observed. "We wanted to make sure all the details were handled properly," Grant said. "Your daughter loves you very much, Mrs. Caldwell, and she wants to make sure you're taken care of." I looked up at Harlow, who was standing behind Grant's chair with her hands on his shoulders, presenting the picture of a united, caring couple. "And Maisie? What does she think about Grandma moving away?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Harlow's face. "Children adjust quickly. She'll visit you all the time." "Will she? Or would those visits become less frequent once I was safely tucked away and no longer useful?" I set the papers aside and stood up. "You know what? I think I need a moment to process all this. It's quite a big decision." "Mother, the facility is expecting you this afternoon," Harlow said, her voice taking on an edge. "We've already made the arrangements." "I understand." I just need a few minutes to gather my thoughts. I smiled at them both, the same warm smile I'd used to charm everyone from bank presidents to grocery store clerks. Why don't you two discuss the details while I freshen up? I walked calmly upstairs, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors with measured precision. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, allowing myself exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of their betrayal. 30 seconds to acknowledge that my own daughter was willing to steal from me, lie to me, and abandon me for money. Then I straightened my shoulders, touched up my lipstick, and began to plan their destruction. Before we continue with Vivian's incredible story, I want you to know that if this resonates with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, betrayed by family, or pushed aside when you still had so much to give, then you're exactly where you need to be. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Ring that notification bell because trust me, what Vivian does next will leave you cheering. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had family members who thought they could take advantage of you? Let's build a community where we support each other through these painful betrayals. Now, back to Vivian's story, because she's about to show everyone exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. I walked to my window and looked down at the driveway where Grant's Mercedes gleamed in the morning sun. Next to it sat Harlow's white BMW, both cars that they'd bought with money borrowed against their future inheritance. They'd been living off expectations, spending money they didn't have on the assumption that everything I owned would someday be theirs. They were about to learn the difference between expectation and reality. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in months. Dahlia Monroe answered on the second ring. "Viv? Darling, it's been ages." "Hello, Dahlia," I said, keeping my voice low. "I need a favor. A big one. You know I live for intrigue. What's happening?" "My daughter is trying to have me committed to a nursing home so she can steal my house. I need somewhere to stay while I plan my counterattack." There was a pause, then Dahlia's delighted laughter. "Oh, honey, you've called the right person. Come to the plaza. I'll have the penthouse ready for you in an hour." "Thank you." "And Dahlia?" "This conversation never happened." "What conversation?" "I'll see you soon, darling." I hung up and went to my closet, selecting a simple black dress and my grandmother's pearl necklace. Then I went to my jewelry box and removed a small key hidden behind the velvet lining. The key opened a safety deposit box that contained documents my family didn't know existed, documents that would change everything. I slipped the key into my purse along with my passport, credit cards, and enough cash to last several weeks. Everything else, my clothes, my photographs, my sentimental possessions, could wait. What mattered now was timing. I heard voices downstairs growing more animated. They were probably wondering what was taking me so long, getting anxious about their carefully laid plans. Let them wonder. Let them worry. It was just the beginning of a very long education in consequences. I walked to Maisie's room and found her sitting on her bed, hugging her favorite stuffed elephant. She looked up when I entered, her eyes still red from crying. "Are you leaving now, Grandma Viv?" I sat beside her and took her small hands in mine. "I'm going away for a little while, sweetheart, but I want you to remember something very important. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, Grandma loves you more than anything in the world. Can you remember that?" She nodded solemnly. "Will you come back?" "Oh, yes," I said, kissing her forehead. "Grandma will definitely be back. And when I am, everything is going to be different." I stood and walked to the door, then turned back to look at her one more time. "Maisie, if you ever need me, if you're ever scared or sad, you call this number." I handed her a card with Dahlia's contact information written in my neat script. "Can you keep this safe for me?" She tucked the card under her pillow. "I promise, Grandma Viv." I made my way downstairs, where Harlow and Grant were waiting with barely concealed impatience. They had the papers spread across the coffee table like a battle plan, which, I supposed, was exactly what they were. "Feeling better, Mother?" Harlow asked. "Much better," I said. "In fact, I've never seen things more clearly." I walked past them toward the front door, and I could feel their confusion, like a tangible thing in the air. "Mother, where are you going?" Harlow called. "We need to sign these papers and get you to Sunset Manor." I paused with my hand on the doorknob and turned back to face them. They were both standing now, Grant clutching his precious documents, Harlow's perfectly composed face showing the first cracks of uncertainty. "You know what, darling?" I said, my voice carrying the sweet, reasonable tone that had served me so well over the years. "I've decided that I'm not ready for a nursing home just yet. But thank you for the suggestion. It's been very illuminating." "You can't just leave," Grant said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "We have arrangements, commitments. The facility is expecting." "Then I suggest you call them and cancel," I interrupted, my smile never wavering. "Unless, of course, one of you would like to take my place. I hear assisted living can be quite restful for people who've been working too hard." I opened the door and stepped into the morning sunshine, breathing in the crisp October air. Behind me, I could hear frantic whispers, the rustle of papers, footsteps hurrying across hardwood floors. "Mother," Harlow called from the doorway. "You can't just walk away from this." I turned back one last time, and in that moment, I let them see exactly who they were dealing with. The mask of sweet, aging motherhood fell away, revealing the sharp intelligence and steely determination that had built a fortune they never knew existed. "Watch me," I said. And then I walked away from the house that had been my home for 37 years, leaving behind a daughter who thought she could steal from me and a son-in-law who thought he could manipulate me. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning for this moment longer than they'd been planning against me. The real game was just beginning. The Plaza Hotel had always been my sanctuary in the city, a place where elegance was understood rather than announced, where wealth whispered instead of shouted. As my taxi pulled up to the familiar entrance, I felt the first genuine smile cross my face since Maisie's tearful warning that morning. Dahlia Monroe was waiting for me in the penthouse suite, resplendent in a flowing kaftan that somehow managed to look both exotic and sophisticated. At 61, she remained a force of nature, a former Broadway actress who had traded the spotlight for a life of comfortable luxury after marrying and subsequently outliving 3 wealthy husbands. Her auburn hair was piled high in an elaborate updo, and her dramatic makeup was, as always, flawlessly applied. "Darling," she exclaimed, sweeping me into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and cigarettes. "You look absolutely murderous." I approve completely. "I feel murderous," I admitted, accepting the martini she pressed into my hand. "Extra dirty, just how I like it." "Tell me everything," Dahlia said, settling into the cream-colored sofa that overlooked Central Park. "Start from the beginning and leave out nothing." So I did. I told her about Maisie's warning, about the nursing home ultimatum, about the papers Grant had prepared to strip me of everything I'd worked for. Dahlia listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the complexities of family betrayal, occasionally making small sounds of outrage or disgust. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, swirling the olive in her glass with predatory precision. $22 million, she said finally. "And they have no idea?" "None whatsoever. Charles and I were very careful to keep our real wealth separate from our visible assets. The house, the cars, the obvious investments, those they know about. But the offshore accounts, the real estate holdings, the art collection and storage, all of that exists in a world they've never glimpsed. And legally, it's all yours?" "Every penny." Charles was many things, but he wasn't stupid. Everything was structured to protect me and, eventually, Maisie. Harlow was always too interested in immediate gratification to be trusted with long-term wealth. Dahlia laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Oh, darling, this is going to be fun. What do you have in mind? I set down my martini and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had given me so many opportunities over the years. I'm going to give them exactly what they want, my apparent helplessness and dependence. I'm going to return to that house as the confused, grateful mother who needs their guidance and support. And then I'm going to systematically destroy them. Financially, socially, emotionally. I'm going to strip away every advantage they think they have until they're left with nothing but the reality of who they truly are. Viv, you magnificent, vindictive woman, Dahlia said, raising her glass. How can I help? That was vintage Dahlia, no moral qualms, no attempts to talk me out of revenge, just immediate enthusiasm for whatever chaos we were about to unleash. It was one of the many reasons I loved her. I need you to help me stage my decline. Confusion, memory problems, the kind of vulnerability that makes people drop their guard. Can you still act? Darling, I never stopped acting. Real life just became my stage. She studied me with the calculating gaze that had once mesmerized theater critics. We'll need to be careful about the timing. Too fast and they'll be suspicious. Too slow and they might actually succeed in committing you somewhere. Agreed. I'm thinking 3 to 4 months of gradual deterioration, followed by a very public and very humiliating revelation of the truth. We spent the next 2 hours planning my transformation from sharp-eyed matriarch to confused dependent. Dahlia had suggestions for everything from wardrobe changes to speech patterns, drawing on decades of experience bringing characters to life on stage. You'll need to practice forgetting things, she said, making notes on hotel stationery. But be strategic about what you forget. Remember Maisie's birthday, but forget Grant's name. Recall detailed stories from 30 years ago, but can't remember what you had for lunch. And I'll need to seem increasingly grateful for their help, I added. The more helpless I appear, the more confident they'll become. What about legal documents? They'll try again. I smiled, thinking of the key hidden in my purse. I have contingencies in place. Documents they can sign that will give them exactly what they deserve, nothing more, nothing less. As the afternoon wore on, we refined the plan until it was elegant in its simplicity. I would return home that evening, apologetic and confused about my morning departure. I'd be more receptive to their concerns about my welfare, more willing to consider their suggestions about my future. There's one more thing, I said as Dahlia refilled our glasses. I want to make this as public as possible. When the truth comes out, I want their entire social circle to witness their humiliation. Now you're speaking my language, Dahlia said, her eyes gleaming. I know exactly the event. The Whitmore Foundation Gala next month. 500 of the city's most influential people, half of whom know your family. If you time the revelation right, the story will be in the society pages before the champagne goes flat. Perfect. But I'll need help maintaining the charade until then. Leave that to me, darling. I have friends in low places and even better friends in high ones. We clinked glasses, toasting the beginning of what would either be the most satisfying 4 months of my life or the most spectacular failure of my career in revenge. Either way, it would be infinitely more interesting than spending my golden years in some sterile facility while my daughter spent my money. At 6 o'clock, I called for a car to take me home. Dahlia helped me muss my hair slightly and smudge my lipstick, creating the appearance of someone who'd spent the day in emotional distress rather than plotting the destruction of her enemies. Remember, she said as I prepared to leave, you're not angry anymore. You're confused, sad, maybe a little scared. You need their help and guidance. And you'll be ready when I call? Darling, I haven't had this much fun since my third husband tried to cut me out of his will. This is going to be absolutely delicious. The ride back to Westchester gave me time to settle into character. By the time the car pulled into my driveway, I had transformed from the sharp, calculating woman who had walked out that morning into someone altogether more vulnerable and uncertain. I rang the doorbell, another small touch of confusion, as if I might have forgotten my keys, and waited. When Harlow opened the door, her face was a mixture of relief, concern, and barely concealed irritation. "Mother, thank God. We've been worried sick. Where have you been?" "I'm so sorry, darling," I said, allowing my voice to waver slightly. "I was upset about this morning, and I just started walking. I ended up in the city somehow, and I couldn't remember how to get home. A kind taxi driver helped me." Grant appeared behind her, and I could see him studying my face for signs of deception. But all he saw was an older woman who looked tired, confused, and slightly embarrassed by her own behavior. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you all right?" he asked, his voice careful and professional. "We were concerned about your state of mind when you left this morning." "I know, and I'm sorry. I think this whole nursing home discussion just overwhelmed me. I've lived in this house for so long, and the thought of leaving—" I let my voice trail off, as if the emotions were too much to handle. Harlow and Grant exchanged a look, the kind of look that said they thought they were dealing with someone whose mental faculties were already beginning to decline. "Why don't we sit down and talk?" Harlow suggested, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people used with children and the elderly. "We want to help you, Mother. We want to make sure you're safe and comfortable." I allowed them to guide me to the living room, where the papers from that morning were still spread across the coffee table. I looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. "What are all these documents?" I asked. "Just some paperwork to help with your transition," Grant said smoothly. "Nothing you need to worry about right now. The important thing is that you're home and safe." I nodded gratefully, as if their concern was genuine rather than calculated. "You're both so good to me. I don't know what I'd do without you." And there it was, the first crack in their defenses. I could see them relaxing, reassured by my apparent fragility and dependence. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who could be easily managed and manipulated. They had no idea they were sitting across from their own destruction, served with a smile and a helpless flutter of perfectly manicured hands. The game had officially begun. The next morning, I woke before dawn and spent an hour in front of my mirror, practicing the art of looking older than my years. A little less concealer under my eyes, a slightly shakier hand with my eyeliner, hair that looked like I'd forgotten to brush it properly. By the time I made my way downstairs for breakfast, I was the picture of genteel decline. Harlow was already in the kitchen, dressed for another day of important busy work, scrolling through her phone while sipping coffee from one of my Royal Crown Derby cups. She looked up as I entered, and I could see her cataloging my appearance with the sharp eyes of someone looking for weakness. "Good morning, Mother," she said, her voice carrying that new tone of careful patience. "How did you sleep?" "Not very well," I admitted, adding a slight tremor to my voice. I kept thinking about yesterday, about how confused I was. It's frightening when you can't trust your own mind. It was a masterful touch, admitting to cognitive problems while appearing lucid enough to be aware of them. The kind of thing that would make them feel simultaneously sympathetic and superior. "That's completely normal," Harlow said, standing to pour me coffee. "It's one of the reasons, Grant, and I think some additional support might be helpful." I accepted the coffee with hands that shook just slightly. "You're probably right. I just hate feeling like such a burden." "You're not a burden, Mother. You're family." Family. The word carried such weight when it was spoken with genuine love, and such emptiness when it was used as a manipulation. I smiled at her with watery gratitude, as if her hollow reassurance meant everything to me. Grant appeared in the doorway, already dressed in one of his expensive suits, looking every inch the successful attorney who had everything under control. Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell. Feeling better today? A little, I said, looking down at my coffee cup. I want to apologize again for yesterday. I don't know what came over me. No apologies necessary, he said, settling into his chair with the morning paper. We're just glad you're safe. Over the next week, I threw myself into the role of declining matriarch with the dedication of a method actress. I forgot appointments that had been clearly marked on my calendar. I called Harlow by her sister's name twice, then apologized with confused embarrassment. I left the stove on after making tea, prompting a lecture about safety that I received with humble gratitude. Each incident was carefully calculated to feed into their narrative while avoiding anything that might actually be dangerous. I needed them to see me as incompetent, not insane. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Grant presented me with a new set of documents. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, spreading papers across the dining room table with the solemnity of a peace treaty, Harlow and I have been discussing your situation, and we'd like to propose some changes that might help. I looked at the papers with what I hoped appeared to be earnest confusion. What kind of changes? Well, managing finances can be complicated, and we thought it might be easier if we helped with some of the day-to-day decisions. Nothing major, just things like bill paying, investment management, that sort of thing. Power of attorney documents. Again. But this time, I was supposed to be grateful for their concern rather than suspicious of their motives. That's very thoughtful, I said slowly. I've been having trouble keeping track of things lately. Exactly, Harlow said, sitting beside me and taking my hand. We're not trying to take anything away from you, Mother. We just want to make your life easier. I studied the documents with the careful attention of someone trying to understand something beyond their capabilities. In reality, I was noting every clause, every provision, every loophole they thought they were creating. There's so much legal language, I said finally. I'm not sure I understand it all. That's why Grant prepared a summary, Harlow said, sliding a single-page document across the table. Just the important points. The summary was a masterpiece of misdirection, describing the power of attorney as a simple convenience that would allow your loving family to help with routine financial matters while preserving your independence and control. What it actually did was give them access to every account they knew about while transferring legal decision-making authority to Grant. It was theft disguised as assistance, and they expected me to sign it with grateful tears. This seems very generous, I said, picking up the pen Grant offered. You're both so patient with me. We love you, Mother, Harlow said, and for a moment, I almost believed she meant it. I signed the documents with a slightly shaky hand, adding little flourishes that suggested someone trying to write carefully despite failing motor control. Grant witnessed my signature with obvious satisfaction, probably already calculating how quickly he could access my accounts. There, I said, setting down the pen. Now you can take care of everything, and I don't have to worry about making mistakes. That's exactly right, Grant said, gathering the papers with the care of someone handling treasure maps. We'll take care of everything. That evening, after Harlow and Grant had gone out for dinner with friends, I sat in my study and made several phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a man who had handled my private affairs for 15 years and knew exactly which documents were real and which were elaborate props. Mrs. Caldwell, James Worthington said in his cultured Boston accent, I trust everything is proceeding according to plan? Perfectly. They signed the decoy power of attorney today. How long before they realize it only gives them access to the accounts we want them to see? I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks, assuming they move quickly. The accounts contain approximately $300,000, enough to seem substantial to them, but a tiny fraction of your actual holdings. Excellent. And the real assets. Completely protected. The trust structure you established ensures that your daughter can never access the primary accounts, regardless of what documents she thinks she's obtained. What about Maisie's inheritance? secure in a separate trust that becomes accessible when she turns 25, with distributions beginning at 18 for education and living expenses. Neither parent has any authority over those funds. I smiled, thinking of my granddaughter sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that her future was already secured against whatever financial disasters her parents might create. My second call was to Dahlia, who answered with her usual theatrical flair. "Darling, how goes the performance? Act 1 is complete." They now believe they have legal control over my finances. And they have no idea what they actually control? A few $100,000 in accessible accounts, some aging stocks, and the house itself. Enough to make them feel wealthy and powerful, but not enough to actually matter. Delicious. What's next? Now I begin the gratitude phase. I'm going to shower them with appreciation for their sacrifice, make them feel like the most wonderful children in the world, and slowly convince them to make some very public declarations about their newfound responsibility for my welfare. Oh, Viv, you wicked woman. I can hardly wait to see how this ends. Neither could I. But first, I had to play the grateful dependent for several more weeks, building their confidence until they were ready to take the kind of dramatic actions that would seal their own fate. I hung up the phone and walked to my window, looking out at the garden where Maisie's tire swing hung from the old oak tree. Tomorrow, I would begin phase 2 of my education and consequences. By the time I was finished, Harlow and Grant would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate someone who had spent decades planning for every contingency. Some lessons, I reflected, were best learned through experience. 3 weeks after signing Grant's carefully crafted documents, I began my campaign of generous confusion. It started small, forgetting to mention a valuable stock certificate I discovered in an old jewelry box, then casually revealing that I'd found some important-looking papers in Charles's desk that I couldn't quite understand. I was in the kitchen making my morning coffee when Harlow found me studying a folder with deliberate bewilderment. "Mother, what are you looking at?" she asked, her voice carrying that practiced tone of patient concern. "Oh, darling," I said, looking up with relief. "Maybe you can help me understand these. I found them in your father's study yesterday when I was looking for my reading glasses. They seem important, but all this legal language is so confusing." I handed her the folder, watching as her eyes widened at the contents. Inside were documents for a commercial property in downtown Hartford, a building that had indeed belonged to Charles, though what the papers didn't reveal was that it had been condemned for structural issues and was currently occupied by squatters. "Mother," Harlow said, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement, "this is a property deed. For a building worth, this says it's valued at $1.2 million. Is it?" I asked, blinking in confusion. "I thought it might be important. Your father was always so careful about his investments, but I never really understood the business side of things." Gran appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the scent of money. "What's going on?" "Look at this," Harlow said, practically shoving the papers at him. "Mother found a property deed in Dad's study. It's worth over $1 million. Grant's eyes lit up as he scanned the documents. I could see him mentally calculating property values, tax implications, potential rental income. What he couldn't see was the series of liens, violations, and condemnation notices that would make the property worthless even if it weren't structurally unsound. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "have you found any other papers like this?" "Oh, I don't know," I said, wringing my hands. "There are so many boxes and files. Charles kept everything, but it's all so overwhelming. Maybe you could help me go through them?" The offer hung in the air like bait on a hook. I could see them exchanging glances, already planning their treasure hunt through Charles's papers. "Of course, Mother," Harlow said. "We'd be happy to help you organize everything. In fact, why don't we make a project of it? We can go through all of Dad's files and make sure you understand what you have." "That would be wonderful," I said, clasping my hands together. I've been so worried about missing something important. That afternoon, I led them to Charles's study, a room I'd deliberately left untouched since his death. Oak-paneled walls lined with law books and business journals, a massive desk covered with carefully arranged papers, filing cabinets that suggested decades of meticulous record-keeping. What Harlow and Grant didn't know was that I'd spent the previous month salting the files with tantalizing but ultimately worthless documents. Stock certificates for companies that had gone bankrupt, deeds to properties that existed only on paper, investment statements for accounts that had been closed for years. Goodness, Grant said, surveying the organized chaos. Your husband certainly kept detailed records. Too detailed, I said with a helpless laugh. I can barely find anything in here. That's why I was hoping you could help me make sense of it all. They dove into the files with the enthusiasm of archaeologists discovering a tomb. For every genuine document they found, and there were some, carefully chosen to seem valuable while being essentially worthless, I provided stories about Charles's business acumen and investment strategies. He was always so clever about money, I told them as Harlow discovered a folder of vintage stock certificates. He said the key was diversification and patience. Never put all your eggs in one basket, Vivian, he used to say. These certificates, Harlow said, holding up ornate papers decorated with elaborate designs, they're for something called Meridian Cosmetics. Have you ever heard of it? I frowned thoughtfully. It sounds familiar. I think Charles bought those in the 1980s. He said cosmetics were going to be the next big thing. What I didn't mention was that Meridian Cosmetics had folded in 1987 after their signature product caused widespread allergic reactions. The certificates were beautiful but worthless, expensive wallpaper disguised as investments. Grant was equally entranced by a portfolio of what appeared to be municipal bonds. These are very conservative investments, he told Harlow. Steady, reliable income. Your father was a smart man. The bonds were indeed conservative, so conservative that they'd been called in and redeemed 15 years ago. But the paperwork was impressive, and Grant's legal training didn't extend to municipal finance. Over the next 2 weeks, they discovered a treasure trove of seemingly valuable assets. Property deeds, stock certificates, investment statements, business partnerships. A paper trail that suggested Charles had been far more successful than anyone had realized. Mother, Harlow said one evening as we sat in the living room after dinner, Grant and I have been adding up the value of everything we've found, and it's quite substantial. Is it? I asked, looking pleased but confused. How substantial? Well, it's difficult to get exact figures without having everything appraised, but we're estimating somewhere between $5 and $8 million. I gasped, pressing my hand to my chest. That much? I had no idea Charles left me so well provided for. The thing is, Grant said, leaning forward with his most professional expression, some of these investments require active management. Stock portfolios need to be monitored. Properties need maintenance. Bonds have maturation dates that require attention. Oh my, I said, looking overwhelmed. I wouldn't know how to handle any of that. That's where we can help, Harlow said quickly. Grant has experience with investment management, and I can handle the day-to-day oversight. We could make sure everything is properly maintained and growing. You would do that for me? I asked, my voice trembling with gratitude. Of course, Mother. We're family. There was again that word that meant everything and nothing, depending on who was saying it and why. But I couldn't ask you to take on such a burden, I protested weakly. It's not a burden, Grant assured me. In fact, we'd be honored to help preserve your father's legacy and ensure your financial security. Preserve Charles's legacy. Ensure my financial security. Such noble words for what amounted to elaborate theft. If you really think it's best, I said finally, then I suppose we should make it official. I trust your judgment completely. That weekend, Grant presented me with a new set of documents, powers of attorney specifically designed to give them control over the discovered assets. I signed them with the same grateful confusion I'd shown before, while mentally noting that every account number, every property description, every investment detail led to assets that were either worthless or non-existent. But Harlow and Grant didn't know that. As far as they were concerned, they'd just gained control of a fortune worth millions. I could see it in their eyes, the calculations, the plans, the dreams of luxury that my supposed wealth would fund. They began spending almost immediately. New clothes, expensive dinners, a weekend trip to Napa Valley to research wine investments. They were careful not to be too obvious about it, but I noticed the upgraded handbags, the premium hotel receipts left carelessly on counters, the way they talked about their future plans with newfound confidence. "We should probably start thinking about some improvements to the house," Harlow suggested one morning. "If we're going to be managing Mother's portfolio, we'll need a proper office space." "Good thinking," Grant agreed. "And maybe we should look into updating the security system. With assets of this magnitude, we can't be too careful." They were already thinking like owners rather than caretakers. They'd gone from trying to ship me off to a nursing home to treating my house as their future headquarters. The transformation was as predictable as it was pathetic. If you're enjoying Vivian's masterful manipulation of her greedy family, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this don't come along every day, and you won't want to miss what happens when her daughter and son-in-law realize they've been played. Comment below and let me know. Have you ever dealt with family members who are more interested in your money than your well-being? Share your stories in the comments. Now, let's see what Vivian has planned next, because the golden bait has been taken, and it's time to start reeling in her prey. But my favorite moment came 3 weeks later, when I overheard Harlow on the phone with her friend Caroline from the country club. "No, we're not looking at houses anymore," she was saying, her voice filled with newly acquired importance. "It turns out Mother has much more substantial assets than we realized. We're going to stay here and help her manage everything. It's quite a responsibility, actually, millions of dollars in investments that need professional oversight." Millions of dollars. Professional oversight. Quite a responsibility. I smiled to myself as I continued past her door. She had no idea how right she was about the responsibility part, though not in the way she imagined. Phase 2 was complete. They now believed they controlled a fortune, and they were beginning to live like it. Soon, they would be confident enough to make the kind of public declarations and dramatic gestures that would ensure their humiliation was as spectacular as possible. But first, I needed to introduce them to the final player in my little drama, someone who would add an element of scandal that would make their eventual downfall absolutely irresistible to the society pages. It was time to call in some additional help. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was exactly 6 weeks away, and I needed to establish my new social position before then. It was time for Vivian Caldwell to emerge from her period of confused dependence and begin making the kind of public appearances that would set the stage for the grand finale. I chose the Greenwich Country Club's monthly charity luncheon as my coming-out event. Harlow had been attending these gatherings for years, using them to network with other wives of successful men and establish her credentials as someone worth knowing. Today, I would remind everyone exactly whose daughter she was. "I think I'd like to come with you today," I announced over breakfast, watching Harlow's face carefully for signs of concern. "To the charity luncheon?" she asked, clearly surprised. "Mother, you haven't been to one of those in months. Are you sure you're feeling up to it?" "I think it would be good for me," I said, adding just a touch of uncertainty to my voice. "I've been feeling so isolated lately, and you're always saying how important these social connections are." Grant looked up from his newspaper. "That's actually a good idea. Getting back into normal activities might help with your adjustment." My adjustment. Such a delicate way of referring to what they believed was my cognitive decline. Wonderful, I said, clapping my hands together. I'll wear my blue Chanel suit. The one Charles always said brought out my eyes. At the country club, I made my entrance on Harlow's arm, playing the role of elderly mother being guided back into society by her devoted daughter. But once we were inside, surrounded by the wives and widows of Greenwich's elite, I began my transformation. "Vivian Caldwell," exclaimed Margaret Whitmore, the Foundation's president and Greenwich's unofficial social arbiter. "How lovely to see you out and about. We've missed you at these gatherings." "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice carrying just enough of its old authority to remind her who she was talking to. "I've been dealing with some family matters, but I'm ready to be more social again." As the luncheon progressed, I carefully rebuilt my social position. I complimented the right people, remembered the right names, and demonstrated that my wit and intelligence were as sharp as ever. The contrast with Harlow's careful management of me was deliberately striking. "Your mother seems to be doing much better," whispered Caroline Ashford, sliding into the seat beside Harlow during the dessert course. "I was worried after what you told me about her difficulties." "She has good days and bad days," Harlow replied carefully, glancing over at me as I charmed a table of influential widows with stories from my art-dealing days. "Today seems to be a good day." But the real breakthrough came when I was introduced to Sterling Price, a 25-year-old chef who had been hired to cater the event. He was exactly what I needed: handsome in an unconventional way, clearly intelligent, and young enough to cause exactly the kind of scandal that would make my eventual revelation even more delicious. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said when Margaret introduced us, "I've heard wonderful things about your art collection. I'm something of an art enthusiast myself." "Are you?" I asked, studying his face with interest. "What period interests you most?" "Contemporary pieces, mostly. I find there's something exciting about investing in artists before they become established. The risk makes it more thrilling." "Perfect." "Absolutely perfect." "I completely agree," I said, moving closer to him with the kind of focused attention that would be noticed by everyone watching. "Perhaps you'd like to see some of my collection sometime? I have several contemporary pieces that I think would interest you." I could feel the shift in the room's energy, the subtle turning of heads and sharpening of attention that happened when something potentially scandalous was unfolding. From the corner of my eye, I saw Harlow's expression change from confusion to alarm. "I would be honored," Sterling said, and I could see that he understood exactly what game we were playing. "Wonderful. Perhaps this weekend? I could have my driver pick you up." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. A 59-year-old woman inviting a 25-year-old man to her home to see her art collection. It was the kind of thing that would fuel gossip for months. "Mother," Harlow said, appearing at my elbow with a strained smile, "perhaps we should be getting home." "You look tired," I asked, touching my face with concern. "I feel wonderful. It's been so long since I've had such stimulating conversation." I gave Sterling my card with a smile that could have meant anything and everything. "Call me tomorrow, Mr. Price. I think we have a great deal to discuss." The drive home was tense, with Harlow clearly struggling to find the right way to address what she'd witnessed. "Mother," she said finally, "I'm not sure it's appropriate for you to be socializing with someone so much younger. People might get the wrong impression." "What impression is that, darling?" I asked innocently. "Well, you know how people talk. A woman your age, recently widowed, showing interest in a man young enough to be your son." "Sterling seems like a lovely young man," I said mildly. "Very intelligent, very cultured. I thought you'd approve of me making new friends." "Friends, yes, but what? Are you suggesting there's something inappropriate about my behavior?" Harlow struggled with that one, caught between her desire to control my social interactions and her fear of seeming to accuse her supposedly declining mother of impropriety. "Of course not," she said finally. "I just want to make sure you're being careful." I'm always careful, darling. Your father taught me that. When we arrived home, I could see Grant waiting in the living room with the kind of expression that suggested he'd already been briefed on the afternoon's events. "How's the luncheon?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Wonderful," I said. I met the most interesting young man, a chef and art enthusiast. I've invited him over this weekend to see the collection. Grant and Harlow exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that said they thought I was making decisions beyond my capacity to understand their implications. "Mother," Grant said in his most reasonable lawyer voice, "don't you think it might be wise to discuss social arrangements with us first? Just to make sure everything is appropriate." There it was, the assumption that I was no longer capable of managing my own social life. They wanted control over my finances, my living situation, my medical care, and now my friendships. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I think I'm still capable of choosing my own friends." That evening, I called Dahlia to brief her on the afternoon's developments. "A 25-year-old chef," she said, her delight evident in her voice. "Darling, you're an artist. How did you find him?" "Actually, he found me. And I think he's exactly what we need to add the right touch of scandal to this whole affair." "What's his story?" "Struggling artist, working as a caterer to pay the bills, intelligent enough to understand the game we're playing and charming enough to play it well." "And he's willing to be your boy toy for the next few weeks?" "He's willing to appear to be my boy toy. There's a difference." "Not to the gossip columnists, there isn't." "Oh, Viv, this is going to be spectacular." Over the next few days, I had Sterling over to the house twice, once for dinner and once for what I announced as a private art viewing. Both visits were carefully orchestrated to seem intimate without actually being inappropriate, and both were timed to coincide with moments when Harlow and Grant would witness our interactions. The effect was exactly what I'd hoped for. They were clearly disturbed by what they saw as my inappropriate relationship with a much younger man, but they were afraid to confront me directly for fear of seeming to question my judgment during what they believed was a fragile period of my life. Instead, they began dropping hints about my confusion and poor judgment to their friends, laying the groundwork for what they hoped would be a successful case for having me declared incompetent. What they didn't realize was that every comment they made, every concern they expressed, every attempt to portray me as mentally unstable was being carefully documented by people who would later testify to my complete lucidity and their obvious greed. The stage was set. In 4 weeks, at the Whitmore Foundation Gala, I would deliver the performance of my lifetime. But first, I needed to give Harlow and Grant enough rope to hang themselves with. It was time for the most dangerous phase of my plan, making them confident enough to try to take everything. The beauty of revenge, I'd learned over the years, was not in the grand gesture, but in the accumulation of small humiliations that slowly stripped away someone's dignity and social standing. Over the next 3 weeks, I began a campaign of subtle warfare that left Harlow and Grant increasingly frustrated while appearing to everyone else like the innocent actions of a woman whose judgment was perhaps not quite what it used to be. It started at the Hendersons' anniversary party, one of those elaborate affairs that served as both celebration and social audit for Greenwich's elite. I arrived on Sterling's arm, dressed in vintage Valentino that probably cost more than most people's cars, looking every inch the elegant matriarch except for the obvious age gap with my escort. "Vivian," gushed Patricia Henderson, kissing both my cheeks, "you look absolutely radiant. And who is this charming young man?" "This is Sterling Price," I said, placing my hand possessively on his arm. "He's been helping me reorganize my art collection. Such a brilliant eye for contemporary pieces." I watched as Patricia's gaze moved between Sterling's youthful face and my own, calculating the implications. By tomorrow morning, half of Greenwich would know that Vivian Caldwell was seeing someone young enough to be her grandson. The evening's first small humiliation came when I spotted Harlow across the room, deep in conversation with the Ashfords. I made my way over with Sterling in tow, arriving just as Harlow was explaining her increased responsibilities in managing my affairs. "Mother," she said, her smile bright and brittle. "I didn't realize you were coming tonight. Sterling suggested it," I said airily. "He thought it would be good for me to get out more, socialize with people my own age." I paused just long enough for the irony to sink in. Though between you and me, I find his perspective on life so much more refreshing than most people I know. The Ashfords exchanged glances, clearly processing the implications of my statement. Here was Harlow, trying to establish herself as the responsible daughter managing her aging mother's decline, while I stood before them looking vibrant and independent with a man young enough to be their son. "How wonderful that you're feeling so energetic," Caroline Ashford said carefully. "Oh, I am," I replied. "Sterling has me thinking about all sorts of new adventures. In fact, we're considering a trip to Paris next month. I want to show him the galleries where I used to buy pieces for my collection." I felt rather than saw Harlow's sharp intake of breath. A trip to Paris with Sterling would be social suicide, exactly the kind of scandalous behavior that would confirm everyone's suspicions about my judgment while making her look either complicit or incompetent as my caregiver. "Mother," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "perhaps we should discuss any travel plans as a family first?" "Should we?" I asked, tilting my head with innocent confusion. "I don't recall you asking my permission when you and Grant went to Napa Valley last month." Another small cut, delivered with a smile. I was reminding everyone present that Harlow and Grant had been spending money, my money, as far as anyone knew, on luxury vacations while supposedly caring for my declining faculties. The second humiliation came an hour later when I encountered Margaret Whitmore near the champagne fountain. "Vivian," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women used when they were about to deliver news disguised as concern, "I hope you don't mind my saying, but some people have expressed concern about your recent social choices." "What kind of concern?" I asked, helping myself to champagne with a steady hand that belied any suggestion of mental decline. "Well, your relationship with that young man. People are talking, dear. They're worried that perhaps you're not thinking clearly about the implications." "What implications would those be, Margaret?" She gestured vaguely towards Sterling, who was charming a group of younger wives near the bar. "A woman of your age and social position, involved with someone so young, it reflects on your judgment, Vivian. People are beginning to question your decision-making abilities." "Perfect. Absolutely perfect. I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice carrying just enough steel to remind her who she was talking to, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own relationships. Sterling is intelligent, cultured, and treats me with more respect than most people half his age." "Of course, dear, but nothing, Margaret. I'm 59 years old, not 99. I'm widowed, not dead. And if people choose to gossip about my private life rather than focus on their own, that says more about them than it does about me." I could see her processing my response, noting the sharpness of my rebuttal and the clarity of my thinking. This was not the confused, declining woman that Harlow had been describing to their social circle. The third and most satisfying humiliation came near the end of the evening, when I overheard Grant on the terrace explaining my situation to Robert Whitmore, Margaret's husband, and one of Greenwich's most influential businessmen. "The thing is," Grant was saying in the confidential tone men used when discussing serious matters, "we're concerned about her judgment. She's making some questionable decisions, getting involved with inappropriate people. We're trying to guide her gently, but it's a delicate situation." "How so?" Robert asked. "Well, legally speaking, she's still competent. But practically speaking, she needs supervision. The relationship with this young man is just the latest example of poor decision-making." I chose that moment to step onto the terrace with Sterling, both of us laughing at something he'd just said about the sculpture garden. "Grant, Robert," I said warmly, "what a lovely evening." Sterling and I were just discussing the Hendersons' art collection. Did you know they have 3 pieces by artists I discovered in the 1980s? I have such an eye for talent. I let my gaze rest meaningfully on Sterling as I said this, and I could see Robert Whitmore making his own calculations about what kind of talent I might be referring to. Mrs. Caldwell has incredible stories about the art world, Sterling said, playing his part perfectly. I could listen to her talk about her adventures for hours. Adventures, Grant repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Oh, yes, I said, moving closer to Sterling with a kind of physical familiarity that would fuel gossip for weeks. I was thinking of taking Sterling to see some of the private collections in Europe. He's never been to the Louvre's restricted galleries. That sounds ambitious, Robert said, clearly wondering whether I was planning an educational trip or an extended romantic getaway. I believe in sharing beautiful things with people who can appreciate them, I replied, my hand resting lightly on Sterling's arm. The ride home was tense enough to cut with a knife. Harlow sat rigid in the passenger seat while Grant gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, both of them clearly struggling with how to address the evening's events. Mother, Harlow said finally, we need to talk about your behavior tonight. What about it? The way you were acting with Sterling, the things you said about traveling together. People are starting to talk. People always talk, darling. It's what they do when their own lives are too boring to sustain conversation. This isn't a joke, Grant interjected. Your reputation is at stake. Our family's reputation is at stake. Our family's reputation. As if my supposed romantic entanglements reflected on their social standing rather than their ability to properly supervise the woman they claimed needed their guidance. I wasn't aware that my personal relationships were subject to family approval, I said mildly. They are when your judgment is compromised, Grant snapped, then immediately looked like he regretted the words. There it was, the accusation they'd been dancing around for weeks. According to Grant, my judgment was compromised, which meant I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions about anything, including whom I chose to spend time with. My judgment seems perfectly clear to me, I said. Sterling is intelligent, cultured, and finds my company stimulating. If that makes other people uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own prejudices. Mother, Harlow said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being particularly difficult. We're just trying to protect you. Sometimes when people are going through changes, they make decisions they wouldn't normally make. Changes.
Decline.
Compromised judgment. They were building a case for my incompetence, one carefully chosen word at a time. What they didn't realize was that I was building a case of my own, one that would demonstrate not only my complete mental competence but their obvious greed and manipulation. In 3 weeks, at the Whitmore Foundation Gala, everyone who had witnessed tonight's subtle humiliations would understand exactly what had been happening. But first, I needed to give them one final opportunity to reveal their true intentions. It was time to dangle the ultimate prize in front of them and see just how far they were willing to go to claim it. Time to mention the will. The following Monday morning, I made my announcement over breakfast with a casual air of someone mentioning the weather. I've been thinking about making some changes to my will, I said, buttering my toast with deliberate precision. Sterling has given me some interesting perspectives on legacy and how we choose to be remembered. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Harlow set down her coffee cup with the careful control of someone trying not to break delicate china. Changes? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Nothing dramatic, I said, taking a small bite of toast. Just some adjustments to reflect my current priorities and relationships. Grant appeared in the doorway as if summoned by some invisible signal, his lawyer instincts apparently capable of detecting discussions about wills from 3 rooms away. Did I hear something about estate planning? He asked, settling into his chair with studied casualness. I was just telling Harlow that I'm considering some revisions, I said. It's been 8 years since Charles died, and my circumstances have changed considerably. What kind of revisions? Grant asked, and I could see him mentally shifting into professional mode. Well, for one thing, I want to make sure Sterling is taken care of. He's brought such joy into my life, and I believe in rewarding loyalty and affection. I watched their faces carefully as the implications sank in. The idea of me leaving any significant portion of my estate to a 25-year-old chef was clearly more than they could bear. Over the next week, I escalated the campaign of financial torture with the precision of a master strategist. I had Sterling over for dinner 3 times, each time making comments about wanting to take care of him and ensure his future. I mentioned looking into purchasing a restaurant for him to manage. I casually referenced a significant gift I was planning for his upcoming birthday. But the real masterpiece was the Aspen property. "I've found the most wonderful investment opportunity," I announced on Thursday evening as we sat in the living room after dinner. "A beautiful property in Aspen that would be perfect for weekend getaways." I spread the real estate brochures across the coffee table with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered buried treasure. The photographs showed a rustic lodge nestled in snow-covered mountains, all exposed beams and stone fireplaces and panoramic views. What the brochures didn't clearly indicate was that the lodge was actually a dilapidated hunting cabin with no electricity, questionable plumbing, and a roof that leaked in 12 different places. The asking price of $2.8 million was roughly $2.7 million more than it was worth. "It's quite an investment," Grant said carefully, studying the property details. "I know it seems expensive," I said, "but Sterling thinks it has tremendous potential. We could renovate it together, make it our special retreat." Our special retreat. I could see Harlow's face turning an interesting shade of green. The weekend came and went without any trip to Aspen, though I made sure to be unavailable for most of Saturday and Sunday, letting them imagine me in mountain lodges, making catastrophic financial decisions with Sterling's encouragement. When I returned home Sunday evening, I found them waiting in the living room with expressions that suggested they'd spent the weekend in deep discussion about my mental state and financial future. "How was your trip?" Harlow asked with a kind of forced cheerfulness that indicated anything but genuine interest in my answer. "Wonderful," I said, settling into my chair with a satisfied sigh. "The property is even more beautiful than the photograph suggested." Sterling was absolutely enchanted. That night, I listened to them arguing through the thin walls of the old house. Their voices were too low for me to make out specific words, but the tone was clear enough: panic, frustration, and the growing conviction that they needed to take decisive action to prevent me from destroying what they considered their inheritance. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. The call came on Tuesday morning, exactly as I'd expected it would. Grant's voice was carefully modulated into his most professional tone, the one he used when delivering news that he wanted to seem reasonable and inevitable. "Mrs. Caldwell, Harlow and I have been discussing your recent decisions, and we think it might be beneficial for you to have a more comprehensive evaluation of your financial situation." "What kind of evaluation?" I asked, settling into my favorite chair with my morning coffee. "We'd like to bring in an independent financial advisor, someone who can review all your assets and help you understand the long-term implications of some of the investments you're considering." An independent financial advisor. In other words, someone they'd chosen who would support their narrative that I was making reckless decisions that needed to be controlled. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything look sharp and clear. Richard Pemberton turned out to be exactly what I'd expected: a man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes who radiated the kind of authority that convinced people to trust him with their money. He'd clearly been briefed on my situation. Within the first 10 minutes of our meeting, he'd established that I was a widow, that my family was concerned about my judgment, and that I was considering some significant financial decisions that might not be in my best interest. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, reviewing the portfolio of fake assets that Grant and Harlow had discovered. You have a substantial estate here. These investments represent decades of careful planning by your late husband, which is why it's so important to be cautious about any major changes, Pemberton continued. Your family tells me you're considering some significant purchases and gifts that might impact your long-term financial security. Nothing too dramatic, I said. Just a little property in Aspen and some provisions for someone who's become very important to me. I could see Pemberton making mental notes, probably calculating how much of my estate might be diverted to inappropriate recipients if I wasn't properly supervised. Mrs. Caldwell, he said gently, at your age, it's important to think carefully about preserving your assets for your own care and for your family's future. Sometimes we can develop attachments that might cloud our judgment about financial decisions. That evening at dinner, Grant presented me with a new set of documents, the most comprehensive power of attorney arrangement he'd drafted yet, combined with trust agreements that would essentially transfer all my known assets to his control while providing me with a modest monthly allowance. We've taken Mr. Pemberton's advice, he said, spreading the papers across the dining room table. This structure will protect your assets while ensuring you have everything you need for a comfortable retirement. I signed the documents with the same grateful confusion I'd shown before, creating the final pieces of evidence I'd need for next Friday's revelation. There, I said, setting down the pen. Now you can take care of everything, and I don't have to worry about making mistakes. That's exactly right, Mother, Harlow said, gathering the papers with obvious relief. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. In 1 week, I would stand before 500 of the most influential people in Connecticut and reveal exactly what Harlow and Grant had been trying to do. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully manipulated a confused old woman into signing away her independence. They were about to learn the difference between seeming helpless and being helpless. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was Greenwich Society's most anticipated event of the year. 500 guests in black tie and designer gowns, a ballroom decorated with $15,000 worth of flowers, and enough concentrated wealth to fund a small country. It was exactly the stage I needed for the final act of my little drama. I spent Friday morning in careful preparation, choosing my outfit with the same precision a general might select weapons for battle. The dress was vintage Dior, black silk with intricate beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. My grandmother's diamonds, the real ones, not the copies I'd been wearing around the house, completed the ensemble. Sterling arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, devastatingly handsome in his rented tuxedo. Ready for your grand finale? He asked as he helped me with my wrap. More than ready, I replied. Tonight, my dear daughter and son-in-law are going to learn that underestimating someone is always a mistake. The ballroom was everything I'd expected: crystal chandeliers, massive floral arrangements, and the cream of Connecticut society glittering in their finest jewelry. When Margaret Whitmore announced that I would be making a special presentation, the murmur that rippled through the ballroom was everything I'd hoped for. 500 people turned their attention to me, their faces reflecting various degrees of curiosity, concern, and anticipation. I walked to the podium with the measured stride of someone completely in control of her faculties and her destiny. Good evening, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. Thank you all for being here tonight to support such an important cause. I've asked to speak to you this evening because I have some announcements to make about my future plans. From my position at the podium, I could see Harlow and Grant at their table, both sitting rigidly upright with expressions of barely concealed horror. Many of you know that I've been through some difficult times recently, I continued. The loss of my husband, questions about my health and judgment, concerns about my ability to manage my own affairs. Tonight, I want to address those concerns directly. First, I want to talk about my relationship with Sterling Price. I turned to smile at him. There have been rumors about the nature of our relationship, speculation about my judgment in becoming involved with someone so much younger. I paused, letting the tension build. I want to clarify that Sterling and I are not romantically involved. He's a brilliant young man who has been helping me with a very special project, one that required someone capable of playing a role convincingly enough to fool some very intelligent people. What followed was a 15-minute presentation that destroyed Harlow and Grant more thoroughly than any physical violence could have accomplished. I detailed their attempts to have me declared incompetent, their fraudulent power of attorney documents, their efforts to control assets they believed were worth millions of dollars. The properties and investments they thought they were gaining control of, I explained, were either worthless or non-existent. The stock certificates for Meridian Cosmetics? That company went bankrupt in 1987. The commercial property in Hartford? Condemned and occupied by squatters. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. But here's what they didn't know, I said. During my marriage to Charles, we accumulated assets worth approximately $22 million. Offshore accounts, real estate holdings, art collections, all of it structured to be completely inaccessible to anyone who might try to steal it through legal manipulation. And here's what I've decided to do with that money, I continued. Effective immediately, I'm establishing a private foundation dedicated to supporting elder abuse prevention and financial literacy education. The entire $22 million will be transferred to this foundation, with Sterling Price as the executive director. I stepped back from the podium and returned to my table, where Sterling was waiting with champagne and a smile. "Shall we go?" I asked Sterling. "I thought you'd never ask." We walked out of the ballroom arm in arm, leaving behind a family that had tried to steal from me and a social circle that would never look at them the same way again. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my new home in the Bahamas, watching the sun set over crystal-clear water that seemed to stretch to infinity. The house was everything I dreamed of, modern architecture nestled into tropical landscape, with floor-to-ceiling windows that brought the ocean indoors. Sterling had proven to be everything I'd hoped for and more as the director of the Caldwell Foundation for Elder Protection. His combination of business acumen and genuine compassion had already helped dozens of elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. "Any word from Connecticut?" he asked, joining me on the terrace with 2 glasses of champagne. "Dahlia sent an update yesterday," I said. "Apparently Harlow and Grant have had to sell the house. They're renting a small apartment in Stamford and both working retail jobs to pay their debts." The fall had been swift and merciless. Within days of the gala, news of their attempted financial manipulation had spread through Greenwich society like a contagion. Grant had been quietly asked to leave his law firm. Harlow had been dropped from every committee and social organization she belonged to. "And Maisie?" Sterling asked. "Safely enrolled in an excellent boarding school in Vermont, with full tuition paid through college. She visits me here during school holidays, and she's thriving away from her parents' toxic influence." Over the past 6 months, the Caldwell Foundation had helped investigate 43 cases of suspected elder abuse, resulting in the recovery of over $8 million in stolen assets. We'd also funded financial literacy programs in 12 states and successfully lobbied for stronger legal protections for elderly victims of fraud. As the sun sank lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I'd been a widow living in her daughter's house, apparently dependent on family members who saw her as nothing more than a source of future wealth. Tonight, I was a woman who had taken back her power, protected her granddaughter's future, and created something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayed trust. "Any regrets?" Sterling asked. "None," I said finally. "They made their choices when they decided I was weak enough to steal from. I simply showed them the consequences of those choices." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Hello, Grandma Viv. The voice was small, uncertain, but unmistakably Maisie's. Sweetheart, what are you doing calling so late? Is everything all right? Mommy was crying today, and she said some things about you that I don't understand. She said you tricked them and stole their money and ruined their lives. But you didn't steal anything, did you? It was your money, wasn't it? Yes, sweetheart, I said gently. It was my money. I worked very hard for many years to earn it, and I chose to use it to help other people instead of giving it to your parents. And you're not mad at me? Because I'm their daughter? Oh, Maisie, I could never be mad at you. You're the most important person in my life, and nothing your parents do could ever change how much I love you. After I hung up, Sterling and I sat in comfortable silence, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the sky. At 59, I had more money than I could spend in a lifetime, a mission that gave meaning to my days, and the satisfaction of knowing that I'd protected both my granddaughter and dozens of other vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust. Harlow and Grant had wanted to steal my money and ship me off to a nursing home so they could live in luxury. Instead, they'd learned that some people were much more dangerous than they appeared, and that underestimating someone was always a mistake. The ocean breeze carried the scent of jasmine from my garden. Tomorrow, I would work with Sterling on the Foundation's next initiative. Next month, Maisie would visit and fill the house with laughter and joy. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, free, powerful, and surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. And that's the end of Vivian's incredible journey from victim to victor. What did you think of her elaborate revenge? Did Harlow and Grant get what they deserved, or do you think Vivian went too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your reactions to these stories. If Vivian's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or taken advantage of by people who should have protected you, then you know how important it is to stand up for yourself. Hit that like button if this story spoke to you. Subscribe for more tales of women who refuse to be victims, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Remember, beautiful souls, your age doesn't determine your power, your circumstances don't define your worth, and it's never too late to rewrite your story. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next Her Real Stories. Until then, keep standing in your truth and never let anyone dim your light. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well and making sure justice is served along the way.